We are studying the chapter titled Cosmic Consciousness, in which Sri Aurobindo not only describes the experience of what this consciousness is like as one lives in it, he also describes the gradations within the experience by which one rises into it. And in the passage we are at, he discusses the limitations of the experience when it is not perfect. And it is not perfect because we are still mental beings, and the mind tends to divide something of reality because it is unable to hold the fullness of its oneness. The mentality, when it arrives at the idea or realization of the spirit, the divine, tends to break existence into two opposite halves, the lower and the higher existence. It sees on one side the infinite, the formless, the one, the peace and bliss, the calm and silence, the absolute, the vast and pure. On the other, it sees the finite, the world of forms, the jarring multiplicity, the strife and suffering and imperfect, unreal good, the tormented activity and the futile success, the relative, the limited, and vain and vile. Now he's showing you two extremes with a series of terms describing each of these. We will explore these terms before we... But in the same paragraph, as we had seen last time, he says, to those who make this division, the complete liberation is attainable only in identification with the oneness, with the featurelessness of the infinite. They have to lose the multiplicity. They have to lose the finer play of the infinite. The infinite like a blank, and the domain of forms and multiplicity, which are nothing but the infinite expressing its variations, that is not accessible if they are to be free. Freedom is only possible in this one half and not in the other. He says their liberty depends upon abstention from the cosmic movement. You have to be outside all this lower, which is part of the movement, in order to live in this freedom of the transcendence. If you enter partly even in the lower, then you find yourself sucked. You lose your freedom, you lose your purity, you find yourself sucked into the movement, and with it you have all the problems, the danger of the fall, the loss, the bondage, the stain, all of which we had discussed last time and which he describes here in detail. In such a realization, which is partial, you do not share in the true freedom of the divine. The true freedom of the divine has not only all these, the infinite, formless, one, peace, the absolute, vast, etc., but also it bears all this multiplicity and the division and the play and even the clash of forces. And all these it knows entirely as itself, without this division. And as a result, living in its calm, it can play with the finite. Living in infinity, it can play with the changing appearances. And it masters and dominates the full play from a poise of freedom and mastery, of full power. The moment the mind brings in this fine division, however fine it is, you find it necessary to belong to one side and to avoid the other. And you have not shared in the true freedom and mastery of the divine. And so, from such a poise, the working of the mind, life, and body are viewed from the spiritual planes as something which is not perfect, into which something of its peace can fill, but it is still something which is working within the domain of limitation, and you cannot fully participate and master that domain. How this is to be overcome is the next paragraph. But before we move to that, this list which we saw last time needs to be explored a little bit. On the one side, he has described the infinite, the formless, the one, peace and bliss, the calm, the silence, the absolute, the vast and pure. All these words have capital letters, meaning they are not what we experience in the domain of senses. They represent an altogether different grade of experience. He bothers to put all these terms together because it is possible, in fact, to enter into that experience through any of these facets. Depending on one's temperament, depending on the particular form of our or direction of our aspiration, depending on the form of one's practice or the particular bias of the lineage to which we belong. And without realizing it, we find ourselves aligned to one of these aspects more than others. But through that one aspect, we may enter into that higher existence. And because we've entered it only through that one aspect, it seems as if the entire higher existence is just that aspect. Because entering it through any of these, it is still the higher, the full, the complete, but seen from an angle, a perspective. In the demand of Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga, as the divine knows himself, and this includes all these different facets equally. Means even in the nature of the ascent, one would experience, let's say, one of these facets to begin with, and then perhaps re-enter the same experience through a different facet and another and another. Or one would enter through one of these facets and then, dwelling in the experience, discover all these other facets of the higher existence, whichever form it takes. In the first, he describes the infinite, capital I. We have taken this many times before as an example, but we can repeat. The sense of the infinite to the human mind, because the mind is not capable of knowing infinity, it can only know pieces in relation to other pieces. So the sense of the infinity is for us always a piece going wider, 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 wider. But the true infinity is not something which is growing. It is simply, it is complete. It is not something which is infinite relative to a finiteness. It is not an infinity against which there can be another infinity. There is only one infinity in which there can be many facets of infinities. And that's why the capital I, infinite. In the nature of this infinite consciousness, of the divine infinity, it is not a monotone. It is not a blank which is simply infinite without boundaries. It has within itself innumerable possibilities, infinitely rich, infinitely layered, and each of these are interacting with each other in infinite ways. So the sense of the divine infinite is of an intensely rich, infinitely intense, infinitely varied, such that nothing in it is ever found to repeat itself. And it is because the infinite is of such a nature, when it pours itself to become the universe, it pours and pours and pours unendingly, and nothing in the universe ever repeats itself in all of eternity, across all infinite space. Because always there is more. Because it goes on pouring, and every time there is something new which was not already manifested, inevitably in the experience of the universe, a newness unfolding creates the sense of growth, progress, evolution. Because everything that is poured out already will never be repeated. And therefore something new emerging must provide a degree of surprise, of newness, which could not have been conceived in all that was before. And so the sense of an unfolding and a growth of an evolution. And how far would this continue? Since that is infinite, the growth also is infinite. Evolution is infinite. What would be the possibilities for the future? If you were to conceive with your mind and conceive of the most extraordinary possibilities, those would be included also. But what will come eventually will be beyond what you can conceive at present. And that will be the element of the surprise, of the newness and the delight. So just this one word with a capital I, infinite, if we dwell upon it, it's one view of the divine existence. The second view of it is the formless, capital F. Formlessness, again, to the mind is blank, flat. So you take a canvas, you're going to paint things on it, and the forms of the painting have a reality, can exist because there is a blank, formless. If the canvas had a bias, it has holes, it has bumps, it has curves, it has outlines, it has its own colors and variations of texture, your painting to that extent is biased and limited. Flat, formless, featureless canvas would allow you the full play of possibilities for your painting. The less the canvas interferes in the content, the more free the possibility of your play. Now, in relation to that divine existence, you can look at the lower existence as the painting, the play. And the more this is free, the more the possibility of play is also free. So this formless, the formless, capital F, one begins to conceive of it in this way as a backdrop, as a support. But again, dwelling upon it, one discovers it is not a featureless blank. Rather, you can paint upon it because it already holds the potential of that color, of that pattern. If it did not hold that, you could not put something upon it. And so, that is so free as to be able to hold all possible plays of all possible forms, because it holds them all in its freedom. And so the sense of the formless is not a monotone blank, but of a rich possibility, again infinitely rich, that it holds potential, not expressed. Against that potential, all the expressions can take place. Full freedom of fluidity. And so our sense of the formless now acquires a different feel, but we'll go still deeper. Consider a flower. When it was a bud, and before the bud had even begun to bloom, what would be the form of the bloom? In your mind, you can conceive of various degrees of the blooming. At each of those degrees, there can be a bee comes and breaks off a petal. A child comes and tears off another petal. The sunlight is too intense and burns a part of this petal. The rain wets one patch of the petal. And all these variations that the flower could be as it is blooming, and what variations? Infinitely diverse. All those variations are held in the potential of the bud, which is still about to bloom. The bud knows that when the bee comes, and when this pressure comes upon it, it will respond in this way. This is what it will become. If it does not, and something else comes, it will respond this way, and this is what it will become. And all the possibilities of everything it can be in relation to every experience in the universe are all held in the bud before it has begun to bloom. And take a step back, before the bud itself has emerged, when the first sign that the bud will emerge has begun, all that is still latent in it. And this gives you the sense of the formless. The formlessness of the divine is not a monotone, flat inability, rather it is the infinite possibilities held but withdrawn from any limitation of expression in form. On the brink before it moves forward, that is the poise. Nothing is seen, and yet everything is held fully. And so the experience as one enters the formless is everything is here, complete and simultaneous. You see, if you had a bud beginning to form, and you have elsewhere a leaf beginning to form, and somewhere else another branch beginning to emerge, the fact that they have begun would mean they are separate. You cannot have a branch beginning to form at the same place as the bud which is beginning to form, or the leaf which is beginning to form. But if you go back one step before they begin to form, at this point on the plant, a bud could come, or a leaf, or another branch, or a stem, or something totally different. All of them could be at the same point here, ready and waiting. Okay? So when you are at the poise of the formless, every possibility of every form is at the same time simultaneously held in all its rich possibilities of variation of expression. So entering the formless divine consciousness, one experiences the whole universe and all the infinite possibilities of all the whole universe, all simultaneously present in a single undivided formless experience. And they are all at the same time in the same one. There is no more complete experience possible. It is the completeness of everything being there simultaneously in all its possibilities. So the sense of the experience of the formless is not at all flat and monotone, but entirely rich and complete. You have the very famous Dhyana Shloka, the verse of meditation for the Isha Upanishad, which goes something like this: Purnam Adaha Purnam Idam. Purna here in this sense is fullness, completeness, infinity. Ada is that, idam is this. So that is Purna, complete, infinite, full. This is also complete, infinite, full. Purnat Purnam Udachyate. From that completeness, this completeness emerges. And the next verse says, Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnam Evavashishyate. Even though this completeness has emerged out of that, what remains is still complete. If you think of it in numerical terms, one could draw analogies. You can take an infinity of numbers. Let's say, start counting from 1 to infinity. And you pull out of it every alternate number. Pull out every even number and separate it. What remains, you can again count and it is still infinite. This is the analogy given in mathematics, and they say, this is a great sight. Out of the infinite, you can pull out an infinity and you still have infinity left. No, this is much more deep. That infinite is not of the same nature as this. That is the formless infinite, where all is potential held in that oneness. Out of that you draw out the full potential into manifestation to become the universe. And the universe is infinite and rich and complete, unendingly, and unendingly, and unendingly. Anything you can conceive of, it, if it has not yet been expressed, will be expressed eventually. And so it is as complete as it could ever be. And although the universe pours out from that, nothing there is ever exhausted. Its completeness remains because it is in the formless. And it holds far more than anything which could be drawn out from this, always remaining entirely and complete. So we dwell upon this idea, and you see how it emerges from the sense of the infinite. And Sri Aurobindo has a sequence why he puts these words. There's a reason why he puts these words in this sequence. So, on the one side, the infinite, capital I, the formless, and then the next term he uses, the one. And we dwell on the sense of the formless, what is underlying it, the oneness which can never be lost. Although it can go on pouring unendingly, what it is, what it holds, is never separated, is never divided, is never at any time broken. The sense of one, capital O, again Sri Aurobindo has explained this in his commentary on the Isha Upanishad. He says, it is not the numeric oneness, it is the oneness of identity. All this infinite possibility, infinitely separate, is in that consciousness, in identity, in the same one. There is no other. And so the sense of the oneness also of the divine, the experience of that oneness, is not a monotone, but it is infinite richness, infinite possibility, but never ever separate. The flower drawn out from that oneness as an expression of the oneness is an entire expression of the oneness putting a special front. The galaxy drawn out and expressed from the same oneness is also an entire expression of the oneness putting a special front. And it puts itself as entirely in the flower as in the galaxy. But you will see the flower is inside the galaxy, inside a tree, on a mountain, on a planet, within the solar system, isn't it? So it should be a part of it. And yes, that's only the relation it sets with itself. But it is still the whole flower, it is still the whole galaxy, and it sets up a relationship between these two that this seems to belong and is as if dependent on the other. In reality, each is entirely itself. Now this is for the sense mind at first surprising, because we have been so used to thinking in terms of hierarchies and dependencies. We look at the leaf as a product of the plant. We do not see it as a thing in itself. The flower as a product of the plant and not a thing in itself. The petal as a part of the flower and not a thing in itself. The perfume as an experience or quality of the flower, not a thing in itself. But in fact, for the divine, each of these is entirely itself put out as a special front. And in its entirety, it puts these different forms of itself in relation to each other, organizes these relationships in such a way that we have this appearance of the universe, an appearance of dependences. But in fact, because each is entirely the divine, in principle, each can emerge out of anything. And this is what we would call a miracle. It's a miracle only because it bypasses the normal rhythm of these dependencies. In the Uma Sahasram, 1,000 names of the Divine Mother, many such 1,000 named texts. But in this particular one, composed by Vasishtha Ganapati Muni, he describes how when the divine grace acts in its freedom, bypassing the normal rhythms of nature's energies, then out of a blade of grass, she can burst out an intense fire. And out of the intense fire, she can bring out intense cold. And the idea is precisely the sense of opposites. That there's nothing which is essentially a limitation for the divine capacity because it is free to flow as it chooses. Because everything is itself entirely and freely. And yet all these are held in that oneness, not monotone, but identity. It is one divine which becomes all these. So we have seen three words: the infinite, the formless, the one. And the next two words, the peace and bliss. And he puts them as if next to each other. He could have said the peace, comma, the bliss, but he puts peace and bliss. So there's a suggestion, yes, there is peace, there is bliss, and somehow the two are related also. More related than with the other terms. So the peace, you see how it emerges from the oneness. When there is this infinity, when there is this formless, there is always this suggestion of so much. But when you lean on the aspect of the oneness, there is as if a coming together into stillness, into silence, into one. Non-activity. But it's not a non-activity, it is the peace in which there is no restlessness, no agitation, no movement, against which or out of which all the infinity of the surging energies can pour out or play out. And this foundation is so solid, so complete, so unchanging. And so it becomes capital P, peace. The experience we have, and we make this distinction in our own sensory experience, the distinction between silence and peace. A person is silent. What does it mean? He is not active. A person is peaceful has a different feel. I am peaceful and I can speak when I am peaceful, I can act when I am peaceful without losing that composure of peace. So peace allows or supports activity without itself being distressed or disturbed by the activity. When the peace is complete, you can be in intense activity without losing the peace. And so the sense of the capital P, peace of the higher existence, is this, that it is utterly at rest, even as it pours out or supports the full intensity of all the infinite play of infinite relations, of infinite possibilities. And then at the same time comes bliss. And as if the two are related because the bliss cannot exist without the peace, or rather cannot be known without the peace. It's almost as an adjunct. So let's dwell on this. In the human experience, we have pleasure and pain as a duality. We do not know the experience of bliss. Delight, human delight, is something closer. What is the difference between delight and pleasure? Pleasure has a harder sensory character. Delight has a more essential psychological character. Feel psychologically is this: in the delight there is no agitation. There is a kind of a calm and almost a kind of an equality. In the pleasure there is strong pull or push, attraction or repulsion. There is at the same time the fear of its opposite, and equally intense, pain. Sri Aurobindo explains how in the domain of senses The very same experience can tilt towards pleasure or pain depending on the threshold of what you are able to hold. You take a feather and caress the hand. That's pleasurable. Let the feather grow a little harder, and suddenly it begins to scratch the skin, and at that point, ouch, now it's pain. But the same feather, you could caress the elephant's skin, and it might not even feel the pleasure because it's too thick. And you might have to scrape it harder for the elephant to feel any sense of pleasure. But that same scraping on my skin would be painful. Within our own condition, you will see when the children are playing, they are full of excitement and enthusiasm. They bump into each other, they fall, they have scratches. They do not experience pain. Even the bump is almost a surge pleasurable experience. But the moment the excitement subsides, that same pleasurable sensation crosses the threshold and now it's hurting. So the capacity to handle intensity of contact is your defining feature, separating pleasure and pain. If your capacity was infinite and infinitely sensitive, not dull like the elephant's skin, infinite in its capacity to receive the full impact of the universe and infinitely sensitive to the tiniest nuance of the touch, a tiny atom touching or an entire galaxy smashing, all these are within its range. What would be such an experience? Neither pleasure nor pain, both disappear into something which should be almost a free, delightful character. No fear of ever losing or of being overwhelmed or of pain. Everything and every nuance would be interesting variation of interesting possibilities and play. And that is what brings you closer to the sense of the divine bliss. The bliss of the divine, though, is more than just impact from outside, it is also the experience in identity with the impact. It's not only a surface sensation on the skin, but a full embracement of all that comes in its contact. And so the bliss of the divine consciousness is capable of holding the whole universe. Unless it is infinite, it cannot be blissful. The experience of bliss in the human development requires first the awakening of a consciousness that is infinite, that can hold the world. Then only one can begin to experience or glimpse the nature of the divine bliss. But the second requirement after infinity is overwhelmed. If the intensity of the impact is too great, the whole universe pouring into me, that shakes me up. Then you cannot hold the bliss. Consciousness is in a solid peace, unshakable. That it can be in the poise of mastery, that it can embrace the whole universe and experience bliss. And so the divine bliss has these two requirements, infinity as well as the solidity of the peace. When you have these two, the experience of bliss can begin to develop there. And therefore you see here in the sequence, the infinite, the formless, the one, the peace and bliss. And the experience of divine bliss then is an embracement of the universe, even if it is in the contact of the flower. You smell the flower and you experience the contact through the smell, the entirety of the flower, which is the entirety of the universe, which is the entirety of the divine, behind, pouring through the perfume, the form, the touch of the flower, or of whatever else. And so, bliss with a capital E. Next, after this, the calm and silence. So far, in all the words we have seen, there is the oneness and multiplicity, the foundation and the play included or implied. Now it's as if the list shifts to something which is one-sided. Behind that peace, the silence, the calm, which does not participate in the movement and in the play. So why, again, he's put calm and silence together? Because they're related. One would have even blurred them into a single word. That he takes trouble to give you two different words suggests something to be explored in this variation. But first the calm. So behind the peace is the calm. That is a part which is not affected by the movement, not disturbed by it, and is still holding the infinity and the oneness behind. But its focus is on its own undisturbed poise. The silence takes it a degree further, where it is not even undisturbed, it has no movement. It as if turns into itself in its own stillness and rests in it. Silence, avoiding, rejecting, or transcending all movement and play. In the way Sri Aurobindo articulates it elsewhere, the silence of the self, or the aspect of the self which is turning away from the play, is the self asserting its freedom from all the limitations that it can pour out of itself. On the one hand, it is free to pour out everything. On the other hand, after pouring out everything, it still remains the infinite, the one, the formless. And it is that aspect which highlights its freedom from all that it pours out, its transcendence of everything, which is this aspect, which is a negation, as if a turning away from. So the calm and the silence are as if complementary aspects. The calm still holds the relationship with the play and the form. The silence turns away from it. It's the back, the other side of the calm, facing away and remaining only in a nothing. But again, as we've seen before, in the divine calm, capital C, or silence, capital S, it is not a nothing. The experience, in fact, is of a fullness. The nature of the silence, of the higher existence, of the divine, of the self, is one of something so profound, so complete, so dense, so solid, as if against it the whole world and all the play of the world is ephemeral, unreal, imaginary appearance, rapidly fading out, because this solidity is so real, so much more dense and complete. And so again, it is not a silence of a passivity, it has a positive content to the silence. And it is so overwhelming, as if the whole universe is dissolved into its silence. The calm would be the same silence now turning to relate to the world, but without itself being involved or interested in the world. And it watches with a calm. And in the silence, it extinguishes all that play and is simply steeped in this depth of solid intensity. From this, Sri Aurobindo moves to one more word, the Absolute. In fact, through the silence, if one dwells on it and goes deeper into its core, one comes to that which transcends all the relativities. And so the Absolute, capital A. In the human experience, we do not know what is absolute, because everything here is relative. Everything is seen in terms of something else. I'm telling you the truth, the absolute truth. And of course, you can create some circumstance in which my absolute truth is found to be completely false. Or you take a false statement and you can construct some circumstance in which this becomes true. Nothing at all in the universe which you can really say is absolute. And yet we have things which approach, things which represent the absolute. And one of the most beautiful symbols of the absolute is perhaps The peak of the mountain. Take an idealized mountain. Let's describe it more like a cone. You have slopes all around, and everything converges to a single point. At any place on the mountain, as you climb up, there is a direction towards the center. Each of these directions is unique. There are no two which are pointing in exactly the same. There are no two which are parallel. On the east side of the mountain, the peak is on the west. On the west side, the peak is on the east. And everywhere the peak is pointing to in a different direction. Okay? So they are as if all of them complementary. All these relatives of direction, all of them need somehow to merge in order to attain to that. When you approach the mountain peak and finally reach it, where are you? Which direction are you? There is no direction. You can say you are directionless, absolute, or you include all directions. Also another way of looking at the absolute. If you saw it purely in a mental idea, directionless and all directions seem to be opposite. Right? How can you be directionless and you can be all directions at the same time? No, that's opposite to each other. But if you look at the experience of being at the peak, then you see these are just two facets of that experience. When you're one with that point, and you have to really imagine the mathematical absolute point. Like one atom perhaps resting at the top of this cone. Which direction is it pointing? All the directions. None of the directions. No, it's all the directions. It includes them all, but somehow is none of them. You see the sense of it? They're just two different ways. In one, the point looks out to the relativities, and so it is all directions together. In the other aspect, it enjoys its freedom from all the relativities and says, I am none of them. I am all of them, I am none of them. But it's still the same point. Looking down, looking up. Okay? And there you have the sense of the absolute. A less complicated image would be a flat circle and the point center of the circle, and you draw a line around it. Each line is pointing in a different direction. The center is the convergence of all the lines, and yet it is none of the lines. A similar idea. But here we get some glimpse of the nature of the absolute. And so in the consciousness of the divine, what is the absolute? Everything in the universe being relative, you can conceive of it as becoming a little better, a little more perfect, a little more close to the ideal. This flower, if it were an ideal flower, what would it be like? So a little better and a little better. And take everything to its natural highest perfection, and you're approaching the absolute. And so it's as if in everything there is a sense of a journey, a development, a possibility of becoming perfect, which points towards its own absolute. And when all the things in the universe merge towards or come together into their absolute, they come to only one, because there is only one absolute, which includes all of them and yet is none of them. And so the sense of the absolute at the same time includes everything in the universe and all relativities and the perfection of all the relativities, and nothing is left out. And at the same time it has the transcendence beyond all relativities. And so the capital A, absolute. And from this, Sri Aurobindo moves to two more words, the vast and pure. Again, these two have been associated somehow, and we have to explore why. Let's reread the list. The infinite, the formless, the one, the peace and bliss, the calm and silence, the absolute, the vast and pure. Now here in this, just as we move through this list and suddenly the sense of vast comes, you realize that this vast is not the infinity which we discussed earlier. It is as if a consciousness so free, encompassing, including all these things, the infinite, the formless, the one, the peace and bliss, the calm, the silence, the absolute, and always behind all these is the sense of something vast. It's something which is almost like a consciousness which is free, without boundaries, without limits, simply is. And this sense of the vast, as if the atmosphere, the presiding support of all these different aspects or experiences, that is always free of all these limitations, all these forms, all these aspects, anything one could conceive of. And therefore, the pure, free of any stain or limitation or imperfection or incapacity or. And so this last, vast and pure, takes it into a very different grade of perception. This is the higher existence. Any of these, one of these facets, or some combination of these facets, could be your reference for the divine. And is in fact the case if you look at the history of spirituality. For different lineages, different religions, different traditions, different practices, each aiming at the divine turns to one of these and makes that its focal point and aligns all its practices and ideas around that one aspect. And because the whole of your consciousness is oriented to just that one thing, which is your conception of the divine, that becomes your complete experience of the divine. Except it's not complete. It's only your limitation because you put blinkers in your approach to the divine. But in fact, the divine is all of these, and yet free of these, vast and pure. On the other side, and when the mind looks, here is the higher existence, and the other side is the lower existence. What is that made of? It sees the finite. Everything here in our human experience of the world is pieces, finite, measurable. You can say the whole universe is humongously large, but still measurable. It may be a gigantic number, still measurable. Scientists in fact do claim to calculate the number of atoms in the universe, and they give you some number with so many zeros. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe there is 100 times more. Maybe there's 1,000 times more. Maybe they're still wrong. There's 1,000,000 times more. But any amount that you may put, it's still measurable. It can be represented finitely, or so it appears at least. So on the other side, it sees the finite, the world of forms. Everything exists as a form. Two forms can enter into collision. In material world, two forms cannot coexist in the same space. But in the subtler worlds, they can coexist in the same space. So if I take this flower and another flower and I try to put them both at the same location, well, they bang. Why? Because the form is rigid. That's the nature of matter, annamaya. If you shift up one grade, in the subtle physical even, there can be some fuzziness. Enter into the vital world, they can coexist. They will still be totally different, but in the same space. Just as in your heart, you may feel happiness and at the same time a sense of fear, embarrassment, bittersweet, love. It's at the same time a mix of many different emotions. They're all taking the same space, but each is a distinct form. Sometimes they blur into each other or one flows into another, and yet they're different forms. And in the vital world, it can be like this. Shift a grade more into the mental world, each idea is a form, and simultaneously many ideas can take the same space. They can enter into relation with each other. One can become a part of another. One can be subsumed by the other. But they can all coexist in the same space in your mind. And it is in this way that in the universe, on the higher planes, you have entire worlds of consciousness, of special qualities, of domains of different experiences simultaneously superimposed. Each entirely distinct in itself, in its experiences, but in location right here, right now. You can shift your tuning of your consciousness to enter this world and experience it, or tune into another and experience that, but it's all happening right here, right now. There's even an experience which can be had sitting here in the body with eyes open. If one is able to do that, to shift the levels of consciousness. As you shift gradations, the physical world is tuned out, the subtle physical grades of consciousness tune in, and then they tune out, and the lower vital grades tune in, they tune out, the higher vital, lower mental, higher mental, and higher grades. One is as if sweeping through various gradations of consciousness, and on each you're experiencing the world, the whole universe, differently. And on each, the whole universe is infinite, with entire domains, regions of explorations possible, each different, from each grade. How many such grades? Between any two, you can find an infinity of finer grades and finer variations. That's the reality, the richness and complexity of this universe, cosmos. But everywhere there are forms. Forms may be large, forms may be small, forms may be superimposed, but they are still forms. In that divine consciousness, remember the formless, it was as if the essence of all these forms and all their variations were held in a single one, indivisible. And here, it's as if all those possibilities have been pushed out and are now competing, playing and interacting with each other. There's an experience in which these two actually merge. I'm digressing from the text, but if you enter the divine, capital F, remember what we discussed before, all these possibilities in their essence. Now dwell on each of these possibilities unfolding, pouring out, interacting with each other, and more engaged with each other, more and more interdependent in their engagement. At some point, you begin to experience this world of forms. You move back to their essence, and you come back to the pure, formless essence which holds everything together. There's in fact a continuity. It is this ability to shift or slide between these which can give you the experience of the formless divine here in the world of form. It is this kind of experience which is the basis of what Sri Aurobindo and Mother have given so much importance to in this yoga, which is the centering in the psychic being. In the psychic consciousness, it is as if one is going to the essence of the form on every level of our consciousness, through the mind, through the life force, emotions, even through the material consciousness. Going back into the essence, it's as if one essence, and yet supporting all these different planes, and that becomes the domain of the psychic. And from there, one moves back into the experience of forms, and there's this separating out of all these gradations. Or you come back to rest into that formless essential. I'm pointing to this only because it shows you that in fact these two are not so separate. They are only two extremes of one continuum. So the world, it sees the finite, the world of forms, and now exaggerate this a little more, the jarring multiplicity. When all these possibilities are pouring out and each is trying to assert itself as the most important, as the center of the universe for which the whole universe was created, what happens? There is a collision and conflict and struggle. The jarring multiplicity, the strife, When this multiplicity starts really battling to assert its need over another, you have this strife. And as a result of the strife, the suffering and imperfect, unreal good. Everything is good in a way. Everything seeks to assert its goodness. Everything is or strives to find its fulfillment in its own good, but imperfectly. And its good itself is unreal because seen from a slightly different angle, the same good appears to be bad. And through all this struggle, the tormented activity and futile success. Anything you may achieve which you claim, this is success, wait a little longer and in the sweep of time, it's gone. The greatest creations, the greatest empires, the greatest of any field, in time, somehow, it doesn't matter anymore. And the relative, the limited, and vain, and vile. Everything here is in relativity, everything is in limitation, and everything pretends to be the infinite, the one, the whole, when in fact it is not. It's just a vain imitation and pretense. And on its extreme, it is vile, it is even perverted. And this is the nature of the other side. So the mind, when it looks at reality of the one divine consciousness, it tends to split it into this, the higher and the lower. But as we saw, there's in fact a link. There is a continuum between the two. But the mind is unable to hold this continuum, hold or experience this continuity. For that, one needs to shift consciousness to a higher grade, which is not based on comparing and differentiating. Our very starting point is a mind as a tool. In order to understand this flower, I must look at the not flower. I must cut it out from its background to be able to isolate it and say, this is flower. I must separate and contrast, compare, differentiate, and understand. Or break it up and rejoin to be able to say, yes, it's made of so many petals. But there is a consciousness higher up, just a little bit, the intuitive consciousness, which will look at flower and not say this is made of 25 petals arranged in this particular form. It will look at flower and feel identity of flower and say, it is beautiful. And that's the intuitive consciousness. And it feels, it knows by feeling from within out. Already that can begin to experience the world differently. Through all this strife and struggle, it feels behind, there is a harmony which is trying to express. There's a delight behind the appearance of struggle. And it's able to feel it. But still it may not be able to reconcile, because it is an operating in the realm of finites. And one rises still higher into a grade of consciousness which Sri Aurobindo calls the overmental, which then is able to embrace the whole, but from a perspective, from an angle, from a bias, until it rises into the one consciousness of the divine, the creative power of the divine, the supramental, in which it knows the whole oneness as the divine knows it. It knows the oneness, it knows the multiplicity and the continuum and the perfect arrangement of why things are the way they are in relation to each other in an unfolding sequence. Everything is perfectly placed and so beautiful, wonderful, adbhuta. This is the word used in the Veda. When the Rishi experiences this, what a wonder. So there is this consciousness which holds it all, oneness and multiplicity. Our mind needs to, by its very working, separate these. And so this division. So this whole paragraph and all that he describes as a result of this division, we have studied last time. We came back only to explore these many facets of the description of the higher existence and the lower. As long as we live in this division, that there is a higher and there is a lower, Our freedom lies in identification with the higher as opposed to the lower, disengaging ourselves from the lower. The moment we enter the lower, we find ourselves sucked into its limitation and incapacity. And so we are required to live in a partial experience of the divine consciousness, in what seems to be a freedom, but is not a poise of mastery. The divine himself lives in that oneness, that infinity, formless, vast bliss, etc., and at the same time pours to become all this from a poise of mastery. Everything that he pours out to be is in full mastery of his energies, in perfect relation and alignment with everything else that is poured out from him with full intensity. He throws himself into his manifestation without fear of losing himself, without fear of being stuck and bound. And that's the true nature of the poise of mastery, to which we have to attain also. And that would be the true cosmic consciousness and the true freedom in participation, in engagement in life. So this is the ideal that Sri Aurobindo places before us. How to move to that? So remember, so far he has described an experience of the cosmic consciousness. Now we want to complete this. It is only an incomplete experience. We want to complete it. How do we move to this poise where we can be fully engaged in and participating from a poise of mastery? This becomes the theme of the next paragraph. So all this limitation and incapacity, he says, particularly in our embodied experience, the workings of mind, life and body are viewed from the calm and peace of the spiritual planes. And from there, they can be filled with the calm and peace. But they have not been possessed and they have not been subjected to the law of the all-mastering spirit. This is how the previous paragraph had ended. So we have a mind, we have a life, we have a body, into which from the spiritual heights, this calm, this peace pours in. In my action in the world, therefore, I may experience this calm and peace. I may be able to face circumstances with calm and peace, but not yet with the mastery. I may still be overwhelmed. I may still be crushed. I may still be unable to deal with, although calm and peaceful internally. So now the next paragraph, this condition, this situation with the division. This is when the mental being takes its station in its own spiritual planes, in the mental planes of Sat, Chit, Ananda, and casts down their light and delight upon the lower existence. And this again we had discussed last time, what this means, this mental planes, subplane of Satchidananda. Remember, in the previous chapters, this whole question had been dealt with. If you enter directly into the pure Satchidananda, because there is nothing common to our human realm of consciousness, you will be in a state of trance, in the Satchidananda. You'll step out of it to re-enter the mind, life, body, you will lose the Satchidananda. You cannot seem to have both. The only way you can begin to experience is if in the mental domain you turn to its own higher gradations. And remember, the idea behind that was all these planes are within each other. Not only they are entire worlds in themselves, but within each world all of them are represented. So in the domain of mind there are parts, higher gradations of mind. They are still mind, which are not fully developed in us, but they are still present as a potential undeveloped grade. By becoming conscious in them, by developing and awakening in those planes, we can experience the Sat, Chit and Ananda in and through a mental consciousness. And so it is in such an experience that this limitation is had. I live in that, and yet my mind, life, body are in a calm and peace, but not in a poise of the all-mastering consciousness. From this higher level, they cast down their light and delight upon the lower existence. What's happening to the mind, life and body? Well, they're still there as vehicles, finite and limited, with whatever it was that I have grown with or the best that I have been able to develop out of what I had. Now, he says, but it is possible to attempt to arrive at a kind of cosmic consciousness by dwelling on the lower planes themselves, breaking their limitation laterally, as we have said, and calling down into them the light and largeness of the higher existence. The wording is very suggestive. He says, it is possible to attempt to arrive at a kind of cosmic consciousness. All of these modifiers, placing limitations, but still, it's possible to attempt at a kind of. So it won't be in itself the true cosmic consciousness. You can make an attempt, but it may not be quite the thing which you will get to. It's possible to try, but it may be extremely difficult. Okay. All of this having been understood, we'll also see why it is so. The reality is, if you go from below, the way he's describing now, you can start here and try total consciousness, open out the vital consciousness, open out the physical, and try thus by breaking these boundaries to attain to some cosmic consciousness. What you will attain will be a kind of cosmic consciousness. You will never arrive at it completely, and the effort itself will be extremely difficult because you're starting with an incapacity, you're starting with an instrument which is itself the very opposite of what you're trying to reach at. If you want to cut a diamond, you could take a piece of bamboo and start scraping and keep on scraping for a few million years. It's going to take a long time. Even with a metal saw, after a while the saw will get blunted. Do you know how they cut diamond? With another diamond. Interesting. To cut a diamond, you need another diamond. Otherwise you can't. To arrive at a divine consciousness, you cannot think yourself into it with a mental consciousness. You cannot work yourself into it by running in the body. You see, you can only attain to it by divine consciousness. So if you start bottom up and laterally try to open out to a cosmic consciousness, all this you can understand now. It is possible to attempt to arrive at a kind of cosmic consciousness. But the reverse can be done. You can attain to that by the means already discussed earlier, into the spiritual and larger cosmic consciousness, and from there you can bring it down, to say. Use an already attained consciousness to turn upon the mind, life and body and work to remove its barriers. And yes, that would be possible. Not only possible, it would be much easier, and what it would reach to would be real and quite likely more complete. But so we're looking at it now this way and that way, from below up and from the top down, as we will go on. By dwelling on the lower plane themselves, so focus will be right here in this mind, life, body, breaking their limitations laterally. So I'm going to try to widen my mind, widen my life energies, widen the body consciousness. And as we have said, calling down into them the light and largeness of the higher existence. And so it's as if my mind turns up and feels this higher possibility and aspires to bring it down or calls it down so that it can fill and awaken in me something of its character. And this is possible for a reason, and he explains now why. Not only spirit is one, but mind, capital M, life, capital L, and matter, capital M, are one. So we have suddenly a different picture. So far we saw spirit as oneness and all these as somehow fragmented, finite pieces in collision. But if you look at the totality of mind and all the fragmentations in it, the totality of mind itself is a continuum. The totality of life energies is a continuum. The totality of matter is a continuum. They also are one. You cannot say mind is one with life or life is one with matter. They are distinct. But within themselves they seem to be one. There is one cosmic mind, one cosmic life, one cosmic body. Except that there's nothing in us which is able somehow to tune into that directly. But now he explains how this relates to our limited experience. All the attempt of man to arrive at universal sympathy, universal love, and the understanding and knowledge of the inner soul of other existences is an attempt to beat thin, breach, and eventually break down by the power of the enlarging mind and heart the walls of the ego and arrive nearer to a cosmic oneness. So here we come to one of the most profound and powerful impulses of the human spirit, which is what makes humanity great. And this is the impulse to arrive at universal sympathy, universal love, and understand and know the inner soul of other existences. Three things. Sympathy first. We have sympathy. Easiest among siblings, among parent and child, within the family. It's easy. A little larger among friends, but that takes time also. And a little larger perhaps in time as we grow older, we begin to empathize, sympathize and so on. The realm and the scope broadens. Not the same for all, does not happen automatically necessarily. But it is there. We may consciously cultivate it, as in many religious traditions. We may consciously cultivate it because of some impulse within us that says, but I should be able to, I want to. Where did that impulse come from? Somewhere inside you. Why? Because it senses that this represents a deeper truth, a deeper reality of myself. If I am unable to feel this sympathy with others, I am narrow, I am limited, I am incomplete. And the more I am able to feel this sympathy, I feel myself free, I feel myself large, I feel myself more complete, because everybody is as if myself. And this push, this impulse is nothing but an inner truth known and felt deep within, which wants to now express and find its outer manifestation. Universal sympathy. It won't stop with just my family, my tribe, my nation. It must include everything. In the Buddhist tradition, they will speak of all sentient beings. Now, what does that include? Not only humans, but also animals and trees and perhaps even beings on other planets, which we may have no idea of. All sentient beings. Suddenly your mind opens out, all over the universe there are sentient beings. All of them are suffering, and that's the starting point of the Buddhist approach. There is suffering. It's the one thing you cannot avoid. The universe is full of that. All sentient beings are suffering. And to all those sentient beings, to get them free of that suffering, to give them some freedom in some liberation of some kind. But the goal is, in the very thought, a universal sympathy. The second is universal love. Now you see the distinction between sympathy and love. In a sympathy, you resonate, you support, but somehow you're separate. In a love, you give yourself. Perhaps even you lose yourself to some degree. You experience an identification to some degree. And so it seems to go beyond merely sympathy. When you love someone or something, suddenly there's a call to unite or to give oneself. Or if it is more egocentric, to absorb the other into oneself. To possess and annihilate separation. The mother observes in the lower gradations of nature, it takes the form of eating. The snake reaches out to eat its prey, and the whole movement is in fact a very loving absorption of the other into oneself. She notes how, I think she observed it in a zoo. There was a snake and they had put some animal to be eaten by the snake as food. First the animal was afraid, and after a while it became quiet, and then it gave itself and was eaten. And the whole experience is one of merging of consciousness. She points out it is the same love which you experience, which is experienced in atoms and molecules, which brings them together to bind and to create complex structures. You've seen pictures perhaps of complex chains of molecules and things represented. What brings them together is the same love felt in the very particles of matter. More overt in an emotional response, less obvious in plant, more obvious in animals, but always growing, always attempting for a greater completeness. It is the same which takes on a crude form of the bond among parent and child or among family. And as we become more awake, more conscious and more refined in consciousness, it broadens and widens out. No more based on instinct, but on a deeper awakening. And as this grows, one sees that it is towards all. It's not enough to have it to a few. They have it to another, they have it to another. There's a chain linking us all. Why cannot I experience that? And you'll see in the human experience, it sometimes takes this form where you say, whoever is your friend is my friend. Now extend that, whoever you love, I love. If you just accept this one principle, suddenly, poof, through the chain of entanglements, you love all things. Because everything is somehow, somewhere related. But somewhere inside us, there is also this need to reach out to love and be loved in a cruder form. The need for love is greater than the need to give love. The mother explains, if you observe the phenomenon, it's not the love that you receive from others which makes you happy, but the love that you give. You see this often in human relations. So and so is in love with me. Oh, what a pest. Because I don't feel the same, right? The love you receive is nice, but up to a point. After some time it becomes intrusive, dominating, oppressive even. But when you want to give it, then it is what makes you always joyous. If it is not accepted or if it is rejected, you may have a reaction. But if the love has within it a desire and a claim, if you can filter out the desire and the claim, then just the pure self-giving is a fulfillment in itself. And that is the pure love. And very quickly you realize it is not attached to a particular form. The same thing equally glows out to all beings, maybe differently. But in its purity, it can glow to all things. I'll share with this here in this experience. I've mentioned it before on other occasions, but it would be the right time to share again. When I had completed my studies in the ashram school and I had started working in the ashram archives, every morning I would go with my teacher, MP Pandit, to the ashram. Following his routine, I would go there, we would go to the meditation hall. Then I would meet him in his office and bow before leaving for my work. And as I bowed, he touched my forehead with his finger. And I felt something happy, beautiful, and I went. Over a few weeks, over a few months, I don't know, the experience was deepening, and I didn't realize when and how. Every time that he touched, it was as if in the contact, I saw a ball of liquid golden light entering and gently dropping into my heart, and in my heart bursting, poof. And as it burst out, everything was suddenly so beautiful. And everything was so alive, so conscious, and full of love. And from my heart there was a love, and in all things, from all things there was a love, very gentle, soft, pure. And I could look at people, things, think of people. Even my favorite enemy is the one I loved to feel as an enemy, Love was the defining thing. Other human relations were all subsidiary, secondary ripples with this. And it was very gentle and soft, so natural that it seemed to be the way things should always be. Cannot be otherwise. And so it built over a few weeks, months, years, I don't know when. It was always, the world was magical, sacred, beautiful, special somehow. It's something of this kind of experience. This is the beginning of so much more that has to come. It's just the beginning. But it's a glimpse of this somewhere deep within that calls to us when we want to reach out and experience, give, receive, share, love. And all human love is only a mixed approximation, heavily mixed often with desire and claim of this, which really is the truth of our deepest soul and our deepest existence. And to have this universal love is the push in human beings which makes us widen and connect. Secretly, it's what drives all the widening of consciousness. And the third step, the understanding and knowledge of the inner soul of other existences. And you see how it leads naturally from this second. What is it that you love? Well, you can focus on certain forms. Oh, the way you look at me, the way you smile, the way you walk, the way you speak, and etc. But that's not it. Those are rather pegs on which you hang the experience of love. The love itself is, remove all that. You. That. And what is you? Remove all the forms. What is you? The essence that you are. If you were to discard your body, what would you be? If you were to discard your emotions and your mind, what would you be? That is what you are. Nothing can take away from you what you are. All these are covers, clothings you've put around it to be able to engage with the world and interface with people and forms. But you are that, which is what remains when you discard all this. And the love is from there and to that in others, even if you're not conscious of it. And so inevitably this turning of love prepares and leads to the need to understand and know this inner soul of other existences. And he uses the word existences, not just beings. Because at first it may be to humans that you feel most easily, but when you have that perception or that sensitivity, you find often you can feel it more easily in a flower or in a plant. Because they're so much more gentle and soft and pure. In the humans there's so much clutter, junk, agitation. And often those who have that deeper sensitivity would rather run away from humans and be trees and plants and flowers. The heart can open and be free without fear. But quickly you also sense it is not just in plants and flowers where it is easier, but in all things, even in the rocks, even in objects, in everything, all existences. And so this deeper turn, as one grows in awareness, in maturity, in evolution, it starts with a universal sympathy, grows to a need for universal love, and it eventually settles in this need to understand and know the inner soul of other existences. And says, all the attempt of man to arrive at these three things is in fact only an attempt to beat thin, breach and eventually break down the walls of the ego. The attempt goes through 3 degrees. Beat thin. Every experience is as if a nudge, a knock, a push, an effort. And over time it begins to thin out the ego. For most people that's good enough. I am now universal in my approach. I work for universal rights. I work for universal justice. I serve all human beings in my efforts. Good enough. The ego is still there, but it's thinned. But to go further would need a deeper call, a spiritual call. And at that point, it's not beating thin, but breaks. The breaking of the ego, the breaching, is not enough. You have breached, made a hole, cut through passages. In this state of consciousness, during this activity, for the purpose of this commitment, I am universal. In my sympathy, in my love, or in my perception of the inner soul. Once I switch back from there, here, in these domains, it is me, my protection, my need. So the breaching is a starting point. Eventually, there has to be the breakdown. Eventually break down the walls of the ego. And that process may take time. In the normal evolutionary process, it may take a very long time. But in the yogic process, it may happen quite rapidly. Because one makes a conscious effort. Still, in fact, when one proceeds in this line, there comes a poise where breaches have happened, many breaches, but we are unable to free from the ego simply because we've defined ourselves in terms of the walls by the limitations. What is it like to have that removed? I wouldn't exist. Who will register? Who will appreciate? Who will experience? And the very need to hold a poise of experience and registration is a clinging to something of the walls of the ego. And it is at this point generally that the divine grace intervenes and comes and breaks. And if we have been rigidly attached, it can be painful sometimes. And you may even say, why are you putting me through this? I am so universal, so loving, so. But when it's completed and you finally experience the release, you realize, this is what it was. And you're grateful for it. You laugh. You thank that intervention. This transition is not easy for this reason only, because we don't know what it's like to be free. But always it starts with a thinning, breaching, and eventually breaking down. By what? By the power of the enlarging mind and heart. And this is the normal process of human effort. Your mind grows wider, your heart grows wider, and so you develop, etc. When you look at cultures, more developed and less developed, this characterizes, in a large part, the greater development of a culture. When it is more universal in its sympathy, love, and deeper understanding of the soul of others. When it recasts all its social, political, administrative, governance, and other relations in terms of these things, to make them more universal. Declaration of universal rights. Wow, it's a big step. Putting them into practice, it takes a few centuries. Because you don't feel it. You have to try to live by an appearance of it, but you never really live it. And that needs a sadhana, a yoga. Anyway, but that defines the higher gradations of cultures often. But this enlarging mind, enlarging heart has a power, a push, and a persistence across time. The walls of the ego are thus broken down and arrive nearer to a cosmic oneness. You don't get to it, you just come nearer to it. And in the human experience, that's enough. But this is the setting he places for this breaking down of the walls laterally. He places in the context of this human need and human evolutionary drive. It's in fact pointing to cosmic consciousness. It can never get to it on its own, but that's what it's aiming at, unknowingly. Near to a cosmic oneness. And if we can, by the heart, by the mind and heart, get at the touch of the spirit, receive the powerful inrush of the divine into this lower humanity, and change our nature into a reflection of the divine nature by love, by universal joy, by oneness of mind with all nature and all beings, we can break down the walls. So all these initial attempts, they will fail, they will only reach partial degrees, but we can break down these walls if we do this. And what he describes here is in fact the whole yogic process. First of all, there are two approaches to it, by the mind and by the heart. So temperamentally, some of us would begin by the mind reaching out, some of us would begin by the heart reaching out. A few may practice both. But whichever you start with, eventually you would do both. So if we can, by the mind and heart, get at the touch of the spirit, how would you do that? With the mind, your mind turns to dwell on the spirit. Well, that's the theme of these chapters of the yoga of integral knowledge. The next section, the yoga of love through the heart. But whatever, first point of contact to some touch of the spirit. What touch, which aspect, it doesn't matter which. Whatever is easiest for your mind, for your heart, for your nature, for your need, for the turn of your aspiration. Doesn't matter what form it takes. But get to the touch of the spirit. That is the one consciousness filling the whole universe and the cosmos and transcending it. Conceive of it as the one presence that fills everything in space and in time and exceeds both space and time, pouring into space and time from outside it. Such would be the conception of the spirit. What is your relation with it? You can conceive of it as a divine love pouring into space and time, filling everything. You can conceive of it as a divine power that pours and fills. You can conceive of it as a divine peace that fills and supports. You can conceive of it as an ethereal vastness underlying everything. You can conceive of it as a very personal divine presence. Literally, the flow of the divine energy in all things, which is conscious of you and forms all things and is in you and outside you and in all things, and relate to her as a divine universal mother. Whatever form you feel most helpful, you first set up this link, this relationship. Get at the touch of the spirit. Once that touch is made, it's a passage, it's a two-way connection. From it, receive the powerful inrush of the divine into this lower humanity. So the next step, once the contact is made, is through the contact, that which is higher pours into this which is lower. Remember, we could never have done it on our own. We cannot think ourselves into divinity. But we can, through that contact, receive the inrush of the divine consciousness. And when it rushes, then it may take various forms and aspects again, depending on the nature of the relation and the call. It may be as if a peace that pours into you, or a light, or a power, or a vastness, or a love, or a quiet joy. Any or all of these forms fill us. The third step, change our nature into a reflection of the divine nature. So what happens is, we were this, that was that. As that pours into this, it begins to recast, reconstitute. And this happens quite spontaneously, and especially when taken through this process, it can happen very rapidly. Sometimes one has the experience, even within a few days or weeks, that one has changed so much that at first it may be a little unstable. There are parts in us which may not be fully participating, and one finds oneself falling back as if, and then again falling forward and back, a kind of an oscillation, until those parts not yet receiving directly get suffused with this. Each time you fall back, it's as if something of what you have experienced soaks into those parts which didn't receive. And so a kind of a merging takes place until no more the oscillation remains, only a stable poise on a new level, and your whole nature is transformed. Spontaneously, you feel this, you sense this, you experience it, you live by it now. Your thinking has changed, your emotions, your relationships have changed. Somehow, where earlier your family was your defining closeness, it seems so superficial, so meaningless. What is it that you feel closeness with? Well, everywhere that there is this aspiration, everywhere there is the sense of the sacred or the yearning for the sacred, that's my family, that's my space. The whole meaning of relationships undergoes a change. And one goes through this relatively rapidly. What normally in evolution would have taken many hundreds of lives can even happen within a few years. But always it is the result of the inpouring of that divine into the humanity. Change our nature into a reflection of the divine nature by love, by universal joy, by oneness of mind with all nature and all things. So as this change takes place, what you discover is there is this increase of these things, and as these things grow in you, the nature changes even more. And it supports, each feeds into the other. So by love, increasingly as you grow conscious of it, it widens out and the walls begin to break down. By this universal joy, which you begin to perceive or share or relate to, again there's the widening. By the oneness of mind, you begin to sense that your own mind is only like a little island in a universal mind in which all are islands. And somehow the consciousness widens and feels this continuum with all nature and all beings and walls. Even our bodies are not really separate entities. So far he has looked at the mind and the heart. What happens to this material substance and the body consciousness? Even our bodies are not really separate entities, and therefore our very physical consciousness is capable of oneness with the physical consciousness of others and of the cosmos. Now again in the wording, very suggestively, Sri Aurobindo doesn't say it will happen. He says it is capable of. In fact, it doesn't always happen. Therefore, our physical consciousness is capable of oneness with the physical consciousnesses of others and of the cosmos. What normally happens is in the mind there is this widening most easily, in the heart there is this widening, and these two are so full, so overwhelming that it feels as if even in the physical consciousness you are one, but you are not conscious of your body in fact. Your awareness of the body is your mind's awareness of the body sensations, your heart's awareness of the body feeling. They being universal, it feels as if your body sensation also has this universality, but it's not so. That requires a certain work. And if not consciously done, often is skipped. Well, because it doesn't even feel necessary, because you're so full with the other two layers. When one works upon it consciously, then one finds, oh yes, this brings a much deeper degree and vividness and completeness to that experience of universality. Ramakrishna Paramahansa, you will recall, had this spontaneously whipped in front of him. He looks at the bullock and there is a spontaneous identity in the physical consciousness. Now if it was merely in the mental or vital consciousness, you would say, ouch, that hurts. As we all do. If you see a bullock being whipped violently, something in you shrinks, you feel the hurt of it. That would be an identification in the emotional level. What did he experience? He felt the pain of the whip on his back and shouted in the pain. And the marks of the whip formed on his back. That would be the nature of the physical identification. With what? Everything. At that moment, because his mind dwelt on the bullock, there was the spontaneous identification on the physical. But for one who lives in that consciousness, the whole universe is as if your body. And all human beings are as if in you. Now, one can, of course, it doesn't mean you're overwhelmed. One can modulate the extent to which one may hold or engage with that identification. Even in a universal mind, your mind may be freed, but you may choose to hold a practical focus. In the practical focus, you can choose to turn attention to anything, but for practical reasons, you may hold it to a narrower space. When you need, you may widen to something specific, but the consciousness is free, even though your attention may be put on a limited focus. And so it can be with the physical body also. We may hold a practical focus on which we may put a conscious intention. The mother did this, in fact, with the disciples in the ashram, especially in the early years of the ashram, when she would hold each person in herself at the physical, at the emotional, at the mental, and the spiritual levels, all inclusive. To such a degree that things that happened to their body would be felt by her. The entire space of the ashram, including not just the people, but even the plants and animals and even the buildings, were part of her physical consciousness. The result was, of course, not always convenient. She had given strict instructions that in the main building of the ashram, nothing is to be changed without her explicit permission. And there were many reasons. This was one of the reasons. I don't know if you've ever had this experience. Of course, as I gave the earlier, you see an animal beaten, you feel the shock on you. If you've seen a tree being cut, the hacking, each blow on the tree, some part of us feels it. But something similar is felt when you break a building, especially if that is a part of your consciousness. It can hit you physically, hurt you physically. But there's something more. This was narrated to me by one of her attendants who was seated near her at the playground, and he saw the mother scratching her arm furiously and with some disgust. And he turned and mother explained to him, she said, such and such a person in the ashram was indulging in an act of falsehood. She used some word. The fact that the person was deliberately participating in an activity in his consciousness which was false, contrary to all this space represented, was registering on her body physically. It's not a very nice thing, obviously, but that was the nature of her commitment in the assistance given in the sadhana. So even our bodies are not really separate entities, and therefore our physical consciousness is capable of oneness. So the logic here is, we think we are separate, but actually if you observe carefully, there is a continuous exchange taking place. So this is easy to see at the level of thoughts and emotions. You walk into a marketplace and the energies of the people around, well, they just pass right through you, changing your energies, changing your emotions. Try this as an example. You enter a space which is full of strong desire and greed, and then try to remember the divine. Difficult. You enter a temple space where everybody has been praying, and you try to remember the divine. Oh yeah, it's the most natural thing, so easy. Why? Because of this rush of the emotion, energy, mind formation, thought formation. We are not conscious of how much we are influenced by these environmental states of awareness. In fact, the very first thing one needs to do is to create a space in our life in which we imprint our ideals, our highest thoughts, feelings, emotions, and vibes. A pure space, ideally in our own home or in a part of our house. To be able to establish that is a great help, because now you have a supportive environment. If that can be widened at the level of a community, that is an even greater help, because then there's a mutuality which supports, and that's the whole purpose of a community. Communities like this. But the idea is you have a space. Entering that space, everything becomes easier and the contact is closer and easier. But this, at the level of the body, we are not conscious. Not only there's an exchange of energies physically. If you sit close to a lot of people, you're watching a movie together, standing, listening to a lecture, there's a certain energy which flows across. And very quickly it forms alignments, which makes for a shift in behavior until the whole group begins to behave like one person. They call it crowd psychology. But what it basically says is, once the entanglement of energy is deep enough, the whole moves as one, because it's one energy body. And a person, most politicians, have this kind of a skillful charisma that they can play with the group energy. Often they will create deliberately circumstances for enhancing the group bonding before they come on the scene to play with the energy. So there are many kinds of activities they may have you go through as a group in preparation for that event where they can then hold you and play with you. But again, all of this is still at an energy in the body. But in the body itself, there is something happening. The most obvious is the gross material of the body, which is the food that you eat, which goes out as food for others. Maybe to the plants, but through the plant to others. Now if you think about this, over a few million years, the food you have eaten was formed by the plant. What came out of your body is now already a refined material. It is not like sand. The tree took sand and turned it to fruit. The fruit you ate came out of your body after digestion in a material which is already highly more nutritious and alive than sand, and goes to form in soil the rich biome that allows more life to grow. If you observe this process, you're seeing a transformation of gross physical matter, first through plant and then through other living bodies, and then an exchange in which the whole thing is being raised to higher and higher gradations of a living mass or semi-living mass, more conscious, more refined, much more subtle matter. And our body is actually a part of this mass in the universe, not just energetically but physically. If you shift now to a place where this rich mass has not been sufficiently developed, quickly the body hardens, becomes coarse, crude. You live in a desert long enough where this rich mass has not formed. Your body becomes hardened, coarsened and rigidified. You live in a place which is full of this extreme natural fertility of the soil, and your body becomes more soft, fresh, conscious. We can feel the brightness. So there is a connection which actually makes your body a part of the whole physical domain and connects to other living bodies, all the way down to the most gross material substance of the soil. It's the reason why if you eat food from locally grown materials, that energy flow is more complete, more healthy than if you take from another energy source with which your body is not so easily aligned. When you think of it in these terms, it's so obvious, isn't it? And so he says, even our bodies are not really separate entities, and therefore our very physical consciousness is capable of oneness with the physical consciousness of others and of the cosmos. The yogin is able to feel his body one with all bodies, to be aware of and even to participate in their affections. He can feel constantly the unity of all matter and be aware of his physical being as only a movement in its movements. So if you enter the physical consciousness, you will experience the substance of the universe as this gigantic whirling movement, and inside that your body is one movement whirling in this larger whirl, and all other bodies, parts of this big whirl. And then even this grows to the sea of life as an infinite life, unite in mind and heart with all things and all beings in their desires, struggles, joys and thoughts, as if they were his own, as if occurring in his larger self. And so this is the theme Maybe I'll just read and we will discuss this in greater detail next time. Still more is it possible for him to feel constantly and normally the whole sea of the infinite life as his true vital existence. And his own life is only a wave of that boundless surge. And more easily yet is it possible for him to unite himself in mind and heart with all existences. Be aware of their desires, struggles, joys, sorrows, thoughts, impulses, in a sense as if they were his own. You feel what's happening in them as if it's happening in you, because you are in them, or rather they are in you. At least as occurring in his larger self, hardly less intimate or quite as intimate as the movements of his own heart and mind. This too is a realization of cosmic consciousness. Now you can see what was being discussed earlier at the spiritual level has been as if brought down all the way into the human embodiment, and the cosmicity on these three levels are as if joining with the cosmic, spiritual, divine consciousness. And the impact of this and the meaning of this is taken up in the next paragraph. But this portion we have just read needs further elaboration, which we will continue next Friday. We can pause here and take up any comments or questions.
Sometimes you experience that you meet children that they have cultivated light. And as they grow, this light becomes dim. And by the time they become an adult, you don't even see the light. Is it possible for it to come back?
Yes. The question is, in children often one sees a light which quickly as they grow and even maybe lost. Is it possible for it to come back? If you observe the reason for the dimming, as their personality grows, it forms layers. If the layers are formed in a way that they cover and they conceal, that they live for their own desire, for their own instinct, for their own impulse, or some false external desires, instincts and impulses, not aligned to the light within, then the layers grow to cover the light. If from the beginning, in the formation of these layers, in the education itself, the child was made conscious of the light and the values of its influence formed those layers, then the very same layers would be representing the light and expressing it rather than concealing it. Such would be ideally the education we would want our children to have. But unfortunately, the system is completely perverted to do the very opposite. Sri Aurobindo even refers to the educational system currently as an asuric education. Asuric because it turns you away from the divine, turns you away from your own soul and submits you to the very opposite influences. The result is, as the personality is completed in its formation, the light is completely concealed as if lost. But it is still there inside. And from inside must work through reflections and indirect multiple reflections to slowly push and nudge the personality in some meaningful direction through a slow, painful and often suffocating life experience. It can be brought forward by two things. First, if it is already mature enough inside to be able to break through, maybe find an occasion of a life crisis when the external personality is shaken up, momentarily weakened in its rigidity, and it pushes forward a strong urge. Or it calls for help for the divine, from the divine, and from the divine comes a knock from outside, pushing through from outside as it pushes out from inside. And there's a crushing or breaking, often painful through a shock. And so something is broken and it can then begin to have a larger play, however slowly. This is one way. Or, if you're fortunate, if in the formation of the personality or in the contact with some external environment or influence, a positive support is given. Sometimes it can be one person. So if in my childhood I've had this light, it's now been covered up, I'm in my normal wandering somnambulistic life, I'm basically sleepwalking, driven by desires and impulses. I suddenly meet somebody and I feel, oh, your presence reminds me of something which I've forgotten. I don't know what it is. But I like to be with you because it makes me feel good. Something inside me stirs, I don't know what. And maybe by that repeated contact, it creates an environment in which the personality now starts to feel a lack and call, and may even by conscious instruction may be reminded that it had a light or it has the light, and may choose to participate willingly and turn to find the light. That would be a more obvious awakening taking place, often by an external support and trigger, but of the thing which was already there. And then quickly that can come forward and a link is formed from the inside and outside. That would be a more healthy way to recover. The less healthy way would be through the breaking of the personality, shattering and shock. But the ideal would be that the formation of these layers itself would be done in an alignment to the light, and it is never lost. It will lead always.
In the true moment of love, the joy is when one gives oneself. But in the love that we receive from others, is there no joy in it? If there is joy, is it an illusion?
No, there is a joy in receiving also. Of course, there is a joy in receiving. But the greater joy is in giving. And the mother puts it thus, I will spell out the exact quotation. She says, it is always the love that you give. That makes you happy, because the love that you give is the love that you receive from the divine, who loves eternally and unfailingly. And the recognition is the source of the love itself is from deep within the soul, which itself is like a reflector for the love which is of the divine. The soul, being a part of the divine consciousness, becomes as if its purest receptacle to receive the love and to pour out. But in the very act of giving, what you're doing is receiving. And it is that which is giving you the joy. But that reception directly from the divine is the purest joy. When the same may reflect through other souls and come, if there is the perception of the divine source of it, then that joy also is there in the receiving. When the perception of the divine as the source is not so clear, the joy may be mixed with certain expectations and demands, which may cause often the mixture and the confusion that follows. In the same way as the giving, if it is not pure in its awareness, in its source, it mixes with desire and claim, which again distorts and leads to other problems. But seen in this way, the whole play of the universe unfolding is a play of the divine love, playing out through reflections and colors, through so many forms. Where the whole experience, both of giving and receiving, is meant to be an aspect of the play. You will see little children, the games they play, which give them so much joy, little babies, are all representing this play of the divine. Little baby, you cover your face, and he laughs. What is the laugh? The hiding and the revealing of the divine from himself. That's what is this whole human experience about. The first, the concealment, and then the rediscovery. The losing of the contact, and then the refinding of it. But this is the game. And the other play, you throw the ball, you bounce and it hits, you bounce and you take it back. It's so much fun for the child. What are you doing? You're exchanging. What? From the heart. the love. In different colors, in different shapes, in different movements, in different forms. And everything boils down to just this hide and seek and exchange of the divine delight. Very symbolic, very profound at that age. There are no other games, finally, other than these. They are all variations of these. We'll continue this next Friday then. This 23rd.